I can't imagine a more important task that we collectively have among all the other tasks you already spoke about, than to ensure that the national health care advances affirmed this summer by the U.S. Supreme Court remain intact, are strengthened, not watered down or withdrawn in the coming years. Speaking of advocacy, we have a big job to do. This is only achievable if we, as a broad and engaged constituency, ensure that Congress finds its fine. You have to kind of look. But they will only find it because we collectively demand action and make it too costly for Congress not to do so. We got a job to do. My challenge this morning is to explore with you faith traditions that support and demand advocacy. And given the time and all of our faith traditions and the secular community that finds its spirit from the ethical visions, really need to be included in this. But this morning I'm going to focus our discussions on the three major Abrahamic faiths, beginning from Judaism, which is my family tradition, but then look at the similarities, our paths and obligations within Christianity and Islam. I want to cover the nature and strategic aspects of advocacy, how we strengthen our collective power by harnessing our faith traditions as we advocate for equitable quality health care, as we advocate for community empowerment and justice. And finally, how do we meet the challenges head on, internally within our communities, externally, as we consciously bridge and knit together our faith with advocacy. The marriage of faith with advocacy is such a natural coming together within each of our traditions and obligation, and yet it is one that often triggers within our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, controversy and opposition. When we talk about advocacy, what are we talking about? Becoming an advocate allows you to put your values into action. And as we know, each one of you are already advocates. But according to Nancy Amadei, who's a writer, teacher, and advocate, the word advocacy sometimes conjures up visions of mass demonstrations and public protests or well-paid lobbyists in expensive suits. But a lot of advocacy is just a matter of seeing a need and finding a way to address it. It means literally to plead the cause of another, which most of us do all of the time on behalf of our neighbors, our families, and our friends. Policy advocacy carries that pleading into the political arena, and it does it on behalf of people we may not know personally. It's a practical way to translate our basic values into policies and laws. Advocacy is the coordinated strategic efforts of people to influence decision makers and public attitudes in order to change policies or outcomes. Advocacy requires a shift in the power dynamic between decision makers and advocates. In a successful campaign, advocates build the necessary power to make decision makers meet their demands. In the words of Frederick Douglass, quote, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both. But it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." We talk about faith-based advocacy. It's what you're all doing. Advocacy has a long history in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions and finds its root in the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran. Throughout the sacred texts, guidelines articulate how the faithful should advocate and on whose behalf they should act. Many passages encourage believers to be voices for the marginalized. Our faith compels us to speak out on matters of justice for the sake of community. Faith-based advocacy is essential in political discourse so that justice and righteousness can be accomplished locally, nationally, and globally. We are commanded as faith-based advocates to engage in those arenas where individuals and whole communities are at risk of being stigmatized, oppressed, or silenced. It is most powerful when members from across our faith communities unite to speak on behalf of others, speaking truth to power on behalf of marginalized groups and individuals. Advocacy is often taken by individuals, groups, and organizations to defend, support, protect, or strengthen others. In the effort to bring about justice, advocacy may include education, affecting public policy, joining coalitions, and participating in nonviolent direct actions. Effective advocacy enables and supports individuals and groups working to correct the injustices or abuses to which too many are subjected. But at times, people of faith struggle with how to respond to situations of injustice. Yet there's a widespread desire for people to bring a moral authority and values to discussions and actions while addressing the social and political causes of injustice. However, we frequently see a reticence within our congregations, in each of our faith traditions, to engage in advocacy for fear of being political. How many within their congregations, I'm going to raise my hand, find those voices, those controversies? We can't do this, it's political. We want to do care, hunger, let's do food drives. Food drives are very important, but they don't solve the problem. We have to do the food drives, but we have to address the root causes, right? So I know through my travels through all of our communities, there's not a synagogue, a church, or a mosque that I haven't had connection with, that hasn't had this conversation. We need, if there's one message that I have today, we need to break through that. We need to make political, social, and economic justice advocacy the center of our synagogues, the center of our churches and mosques. That's what life is. That's where it starts. That's where we lead. It's the reticence and often the opposition that runs counter to our faith teachings and that we must tackle. Engaging in advocacy is at the heart of our faith. What gets labeled as political and therefore untouchable are often policy decisions regarding the most important issues impacting people's life and death matters. Healthcare, education, food, jobs, war, and peace. That's political, that's life.
Yeah.
I would argue that our congregation should put these topics at the forefront of their congregational priorities rather than bearing the discussion for the sake of harmony within the community, as is too often the case. Let's take a look at what our faith traditions teach. Demand regarding advocacy. I can speak to you regarding Judaism. I look forward to hearing your reflections and want to share a few passages from each of our traditions. Judaism obligates us to act on behalf of others and level the unequal playing field. When you gather your crops and fail to bring in some of the grain that you have cut, do not go back for it. It is to be left for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. When you have gathered your grapes once, do not go back over the vines a second time. The grapes that are left for the foreigners, orphans, and widows, never forget that you were slaves in Egypt. Never forget that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I have given you this command. The prophets, too, insisted on justice for everyone. Amos, for example, denounced those who trampled on the needy and destroyed the poor in order to gain wealth. He railed against those who lived in luxury while the poor were being crushed. The prophet's main judgments were leveled against idolatry and social injustice. Isaiah states, "How terrible it will be for those who make unfair laws and those who write laws that make life hard for people." If we just take that as our guide and take it into our congregations and remember what Isaiah commanded, demanded, implored as a prophet. How terrible it will be for those who make unfair laws. And he goes on, "Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom be like the noonday." Modern rabbis assure that personal ethics are important. Rabbi Eric Yaffe, former head of the Reformed Jewish movement, says Gemalut Chasadim, or acts of loving kindness, are important. Setting up soup kitchens, food pantries, and clothing drives is important. It is good and right that we reach into the river of despair and rescue people who are drowning. But there comes a time when you need to move upstream and see who's throwing them in. Amos said, "Let justice roll down like waters."
Yeah.
Justice, he said, not charity, and for good reason. Because while charity alleviates the effects of poverty, justice seeks to eliminate its causes. Now, we have ministers in the room. And so forgive me.
That's all right.
I want to hear from you, but let me share as I some that jump out. The Proverbs makes clear the centrality of advocacy in Christianity. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. We have some UCC folks here. Came across Reverend Guest from the UCC Justice and Witness Ministries, explored the topic of advocacy in Christianity, saying, well, the example of Jesus is guide and inspiration. He had a special sense of mission to poor and oppressed people as evidence that in him the messianic promises were being fulfilled. As Christians, our understanding of liberation emerges from the divine act of salvation, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world conquered sin and death for us, we are forgiven, reconciled to God, born anew to be imitators of God, called to sacrificial love for others. Through the gift of eternal life, Jesus sets us free to make the doing of good our purpose in life. Ephesians. Did I pronounce this correctly? Luke proclaimed, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And James asked, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works?"
Right.
Come on.
Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And we are warned that if you refuse to listen to the cry of the poor, your own cry will not be heard. We have a job to do.
Come on, Jane.
We have a job. Islam, at its core and foundation, demands of its adherents to act. Every Muslim, quoting Surah, has a personal ambition at the individual level to become a perfected human being, And the way we perfect ourselves is to try as much as possible to be like the prophet. At the collective level, Allah commands justice, the doing of good, and liberality to kith and kin, and He forbids all shameful deeds and injustice and rebellion. He instructs you that you may receive admonition. Whoever works righteousness, man or woman, and has faith verily, to him will we give a new life, a life that is good and pure, and we will bestow on such their reward according to the best of their actions. Many in the Muslim community aspire to build a society that embodies the values established by the Prophet in Medina. The first 4 caliphs after the Prophet were the most concerned about social justice. Umar, for instance, could not sleep if there was a hungry woman in Medina, and he would roam the streets at night to ensure that all were protected against the injustice of hunger. We need some more roaming today in the streets.
Yes. Yes.
There are 5 simple required observances prescribed in the Quran that all practicing Muslims accept and follow. These pillars of Islam represent the core and common denominator that unites all Muslims. The 3rd pillar of Islam is called zakat, which means purification. Like prayer, which is both an individual and communal responsibility, zakat expresses a Muslim's worship of and thanksgiving to God by supporting the poor. It requires an annual contribution of 2.5% of an individual's wealth and assets, not merely a percentage of annual income. And over the last number of years, and I mentioned that we have sort of built a strong Jewish-Muslim partnership and Jewish-Christian-Muslim partnerships. And one of the areas that I have most observed is the challenge today of Muslims in America. For their faith commitments are commanded to give zakat. And yet some of those same contributions are challenged as nefarious in some conspiratorial, that they're giving to this, then there's some evil intent. It is a commandment, and with those challenges have made the lives of Muslims in America challenged and deeply misunderstood. So this cursory review, this tip of the proverbial iceberg, makes clear our faith foundation for advocacy, for creating societal change. Now, how do we proceed as faith communities or individuals to put our faith traditions to work for change? And let me just share a bit that you all spoke this morning, and I look forward to learning more, and I try to look at the tree back there because there are so many important concepts. We have a tradition in Chicago as one of the centers of organizing in America and in organizing faith communities. In 1966, Dr. King came to Chicago, and he came to Chicago because his lieutenants said to him, there's important organizing going on, and we have a very oppressive government that is oppressing communities in Chicago, and we need your leadership. And as Dr. King was thinking about bringing the civil rights movement north, and his lieutenants from all across the country were vying for where was he going to go, Chicago went out. And as Chicago went out, they brought together their Interreligious Council on Urban Affairs, which included Christians and Jews, predominantly at that time organizing, predominantly, cutting across, so Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and formed the Interreligious Council on Urban Affairs. Over 100 years ago, the Community Renewal Society out of the United Church of Christ was founded over 100 years ago. I'm so envious. Was founded to galvanize communities. The Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, my own organization, was founded almost 50 years ago. For over a decade, we've worked with the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And there are so many instances, the campaign for better health care, your own partnership, the Faith Caucus of the campaign, Interfaith Worker Justice, immigrations, I'm on the board of this.
I have to say ICER.
ICER, Interreligious Council for Immigrants and Refugee Rights. Really the most complicated name around. But these are all instances where faith communities in Chicago have worked together. And as a result, we have to overturn oppression, and there's a lot left, right? But the machine was tackled because there was an Interreligious Council on Urban Affairs joined by community organizations, that same collection of faith leadership, and joined by Dr. King when he came briefly in the mid-60s, galvanized communities and helped to take, finally, parts of the machine down. And I think we need to still take parts of the machine down. But that's been critically important work in building affordable housing, in creating jobs, in getting health centers, right? In getting community financial institutions. So the power of faith communities in Chicago is one that we can look to and remember, and now we need to keep creating. There's a lot to do. And one of the areas that we are looking at, and for a number of years, we were saying earlier, Dr. Morris from the Community Renewal Society and I co-chaired the Justice Coalition of Greater Chicago. We worked with organizations around the city to address issues of police misconduct, and we're gratified to be among those folks who went after Police Commander John Burge, who sits in jail today, but not for long enough. And we heard this morning that there is some justice that's going to come for some of the victims of police misconduct under John Burge. That was an interfaith effort. The leadership of that was an interfaith effort. Working with public housing residents, a coalition to protect public housing. We have lost so many units of public housing. It's a disaster. But the faith community was there. So the few victories that we saw were galvanized in part, taking what we know as our obligation and working with and respecting the grassroots leadership, listening to the issues of community and working in partnership. Because among other things, as faith leaders and as faith communities, we listen. We listen, we understand the wisdom of the communities. Our job is not to lead, but to follow, to listen, to support the voices of the oppressed communities and overturn the inequities. So how do we do that? One of the tools that we've looked at in the last decade increasingly has been the international law, international human rights law. So marrying civil rights laws and tradition with human rights law. So that in public housing, we used it to bring attention to the United Nations, the displacement of residents at Cabrini Green. And a leader from the Special Rapporteur of Housing came to and met with residents and leaders at Cabrini Green and sent a letter to the city saying, this is a violation of human rights law. The massive displacement of residents at Cabrini Green is a violation of human rights law. It needs to stop. It didn't stop. It slowed. More people got commitments for housing, so there were some victories out of that. So as an activist faith community, we need to look to special tools. Amongst that tool is international human rights law. And what are the other ways that we work as advocates? The American Jewish World Services is a international organization, but it has some there are many organizations that have tools. If you go to the website and Google organizing and advocacy, lots of resources come up. So I'm going to go really fast. And I want to, so what are the ways? So they've outlined some steps. Understand your motivation and values, know your issues, know your resources, take note of the time. Take note of the time. Resources and skills that you have. Know your allies. Know the players. Advocate for your position requires that you're familiar with the actors who participate in decision-making regarding public health policies. Find your members of Congress, go on the internet. Just, you can find, it's so easy to do that in those parts of advocacy now. Know what you can do, reach decision makers, plan an event, engage the media, make noise, agitate. Agitate. We need to do those things to care for our community, but then to care for our whole community, we need to agitate. And we need to put our heads together on sound policy and support those policies, organize our congregations. So the Latin American Work Group defined 10 ways to work with religious partners, build relationships, determine your members' religious affiliations, get a variety of religious leaders on board and get them involved early, get invited to religious events, special events that would welcome participation. You can do workshops and presentations, find significant ways to involve the faith community. We want to do more than pray. We want to pray together. We want to learn each other's ways of praying. And then we want to mobilize, because we want to make change, to have a just world that we're commanded to find. Emphasize common ground, treat all people with respect, meet locally, use the buildings, organize, keep supporters from the faith community informed, phone, email, mail. You know, I'm finding that some of our young folks forget that there's a phone and forget that you can meet in person. Email is not enough. Email is really important. The social media is important. But there's nothing more powerful than sitting together.
Yeah.
And we need to remind ourselves, and we need to remind the next generation, not to just email and say, I reached you. And so say thank you. Affirm the importance of each individual's participation in the overall strategy and success of the campaign. Social change is hard to achieve, but possible, even likely, when we strategically and collectively organize, fortified by the power of justice on our side. Along with organizing, among the components to successful advocacy are inspiration, tenacity, and maintaining a long and determined view. These are the qualities that faith aids and embraces. As our search cuts across class, language, faith, and race, we are reminded that our goals for justice and change are not options. They're not options, but they're commandments. As Dr. King prophesied, the arc of history bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. Let us together build the power that creates that bend.